Standing in the courthouse parking lot watching my husband Jake sign the lease on his dream apartment with his 25-year-old girlfriend, I felt the same cold, tactical focus that had kept me alive during 3 tours in Afghanistan. He had no idea. I'd been orchestrating every detail of his perfect new life for the past 6 months, systematically ensuring that his fairy tale romance would become his absolute nightmare. What he was about to discover wasn't just that I knew about his affair. It was that this Army veteran had been playing chess while he thought we were playing checkers. Before I tell you how a decorated combat engineer dismantled her cheating, husband's entire world, piece by piece, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. And if you think you know how this story ends, trust me, you don't. Hit subscribe because what I'm about to share will change how you think about revenge forever. The December wind cut through my jacket as I sat in my truck, positioned with perfect sightlines to the property management office where Jake was about to make the biggest mistake of his life. Through high-powered binoculars, the same ones I'd used to spot IEDs on convoy routes, I watched him laugh at something his girlfriend Megan said, his arm wrapped around her waist with the casual intimacy of a man who thought he'd successfully deceived his wife. What Jake didn't know was that I'd been tracking his every move for 6 months. Every romantic dinner, every weekend getaway, every lie he'd told me about working late or attending construction conferences. My military training had taught me patience, surveillance, and strategic planning, and I'd applied every single skill to documenting his betrayal while preparing the most comprehensive takedown of his life. The apartment complex he was signing, for Harbor View Luxury Residences, wasn't chosen randomly. It was the result of weeks of careful manipulation, fake online reviews I'd created, and strategic conversations with his girlfriend about finding the perfect place to start their new life together. I'd guided them to this specific property because I knew something they didn't. The property management company was under federal investigation for financial fraud, and every lease signed in the past 8 months would be voided within the next 30 days. But that was just the beginning of what I had planned for Jake's perfect new life. 6 months earlier, I'd returned from my final deployment as Staff Sergeant Rebecca Martinez, Army Corps of Engineers, ready to transition from military service to civilian life with the man I'd loved for 8 years. Jake and I had met when I was stationed at Fort Carson before my first deployment, and he'd been my anchor through 3 tours in Afghanistan, 2 in Iraq, and countless months of separation that tested our relationship in ways most couples never experience. Jake worked as a senior project manager for Pinnacle Construction, one of Colorado's largest commercial builders, and we'd built what I thought was an unshakable life together in Colorado Springs. Our house in the foothills had mountain views, a 2-car garage for his truck and my motorcycle, and a backyard where we'd planned to teach our future children how to throw a football and identify constellations. I'd trusted Jake with everything: my heart, my financial power of attorney during deployments, my dreams for our future after the military. He'd been the one constant in a life defined by constant change, the person who made civilian life seem worth transitioning to after 15 years of service to my country. The homecoming should have been perfect. Jake picked me up at the airport, with flowers and tears in his eyes, telling me how proud he was of my service and how excited he was to finally start the next chapter of our lives together. He'd planned a quiet dinner at our favorite restaurant, bought champagne to celebrate my safe return, and promised me that all the waiting and worrying was finally over. But something felt wrong from the moment I walked through our front door. Military training teaches you to notice details that others miss, to identify threats before they become deadly, and to trust your instincts when something doesn't fit the expected pattern. After 3 combat deployments, my survival had depended on recognizing when environments had been compromised, when people were lying, and when situations were more dangerous than they appeared. Our house felt like it had been staged. Everything was too clean, too perfect, like someone had scrubbed away evidence of a different life. The refrigerator contained foods Jake had never eaten before: organic vegetables, expensive wines, fancy cheeses that suggested someone with different tastes, had been shopping. The bathroom had new toiletries, higher-end brands that I'd never purchased, and the medicine cabinet contained prenatal vitamins that definitely weren't mine. Jake's behavior had changed in ways that were subtle but unmistakable to someone trained in human intelligence gathering. He'd developed new habits, new preferences, new mannerisms that suggested significant external influence. His phone was constantly face down. He took calls in other rooms, and he'd started using cologne and styling his hair differently. Most telling was his physical distance from me. The man who used to count down days until my return now seemed almost uncomfortable with my presence. Our conversations felt scripted, his affection seemed performed, and his enthusiasm for our future plans rang hollow. He'd kiss me goodbye in D.C. the morning and hello at night like he was following a checklist rather than expressing genuine emotion. 3 weeks after my return, I found the first concrete evidence of what I'd already suspected. Jake had left his laptop open while he showered, and I saw a text message notification from someone named Sunshine that read, "Can't wait to see you tonight. Wear the cologne I bought you." Instead of confronting him immediately like most wives would have done, I made a tactical decision that would define everything that followed. I was going to conduct a full intelligence operation on my own husband, document every aspect of his betrayal, and then systematically destroy the life he was trying to build with another woman. My military training had taught me that emotional reactions get you killed, but strategic planning keeps you alive. Jake thought he was dealing with a heartbroken wife who would cry, scream, and eventually accept his betrayal. What he was actually dealing with was a combat veteran who knew how to gather intelligence, plan operations, and execute missions with precision that left no room for error. The woman he'd married might have been vulnerable to his deception, but the soldier he'd betrayed was about to teach him why you never underestimate someone who's survived multiple combat deployments and knows exactly how to dismantle an enemy's entire support structure. Jake had no idea that his perfect new life was about to become a perfectly orchestrated nightmare, designed and executed by someone who'd learned tactical planning from the best military minds in the world. The war he'd started with his betrayal was about to begin, and he was fighting an opponent who'd never lost a strategic engagement. 6 months before I watched Jake sign that doomed lease, I was living what I thought was the perfect military wife success story. After 15 years of Army service, including 3 combat deployments that had tested every limit of my physical and mental endurance, I was finally coming home to build the civilian life Jake and I had planned since we first fell in love 8 years earlier. Our story began at a barbecue hosted by my unit commander when I was a young sergeant preparing for my first deployment to Afghanistan. Jake was there as a friend of Captain Morrison's civilian brother, and he stood out immediately. Not because he was the most handsome man there, but because he was the only one who didn't treat me differently when he learned I was infantry trained. Combat engineer heading into a war zone in 3 months. While other guys either got uncomfortable talking to a woman soldier or started asking inappropriate questions about combat, Jake simply asked about my engineering work and seemed genuinely interested in the bridge construction and explosive ordnance disposal training I'd received. He had a construction background himself, working his way up from general laborer to project supervisor for Pinnacle Construction, and we spent hours that first night talking about structural engineering, project management, and the similarities between military and civilian construction challenges. What sealed my attraction to Jake wasn't his easy smile or his genuine respect for my service. It was how he handled my deployment announcement. When I told him I'd be leaving for Afghanistan in 12 weeks, he didn't immediately start talking about how dangerous it would be or suggest that maybe I should consider a different military specialty. Instead, he asked practical questions about communication schedules and whether I'd be able to receive packages, then quietly asked if he could write to me while I was overseas. Those letters became the foundation of everything I thought we'd built together. During my first deployment, Jake wrote twice a week without fail, sending care packages filled with my favorite snacks, books I'd mentioned wanting to read, and photos of Colorado's changing seasons so I wouldn't forget what home looked like. His letters weren't romantic poetry. They were detailed updates about his work projects, funny stories about his friends and family, and thoughtful questions about my experiences that showed he was really listening to what I told him about military life. When I returned from that first deployment, Jake was waiting at the airport with flowers and a carefully planned weekend that showed he'd paid attention to everything I'd written about missing during my time overseas. He'd made reservations at the Mexican restaurant where we'd had our first date, bought tickets to a Rockies game because I'd mentioned craving hot dogs and beer in a crowd of Americans, and planned a hiking trip to one of the mountain trails I'd written about dreaming of during long nights on base. That weekend, I fell completely in love with a man who seemed to understand both the soldier I'd become and the woman I'd always been underneath the uniform. Our relationship deepened over the next 2 years between my deployments. Jake was promoted to senior project manager, earning respect in Colorado's competitive construction industry for his ability to manage complex commercial projects on time and under budget. I advanced to staff sergeant and specialized in explosive ordnance disposal, becoming one of the few women in my unit certified for the most dangerous bomb detection and defusal operations. We were both building careers that demanded everything from us, but we made it work through careful communication and genuine mutual respect. Jake never made me feel guilty for choosing difficult assignments or extending deployments when my unit needed experienced personnel. I never resented the long hours his project management required or the client dinners that kept him out late during construction season. When I deployed for my second tour, this time to Iraq, Jake stepped up his support in ways that proved how committed he was to our future together. He learned about my deployment location and the specific dangers my unit faced, researching Iraqi culture and current events so he could better understand what I was experiencing. His letters became more personal and intimate, sharing his fears about my safety and his dreams about the life we'd build when I finished my military commitment. It was during that second deployment that Jake first brought up marriage. His proposal came in a letter that I read while sitting in a fortified compound outside Baghdad, watching the sunrise over a landscape that had become as familiar as Colorado's mountains. He didn't ask me to marry him. He told me that he wanted to spend his life with someone brave enough to serve her country and strong enough to handle everything military life demanded. He wanted to be the person I came home to, the one who understood what my service meant and who would support whatever came next in my career. I said yes in a video call that took 3 attempts to connect through military communications, crying, tears of happiness in front of my entire unit, while Jake held up a simple but perfect diamond ring he'd bought after consulting with my sister about what I'd want. We married during my leave between deployments, a small ceremony at Fort Carson's chapel with my military family and his civilian one celebrating a union that felt like the perfect blend of strength and stability. Jake looked incredibly handsome in his dark suit, but what I remember most was the way he looked at me in my dress uniform, with pride and respect that made me feel beautiful and powerful at the same time. Our first 3 years of marriage were a constant exercise in making love work across distance and danger. Jake became an expert at navigating military communication systems, staying up late to catch my rare phone calls and coordinating his work schedule around my unpredictable availability. He sent packages filled with everything from practical items I needed in the field to romantic surprises that reminded me I was more than just a soldier. Most importantly, Jake became my advocate in the civilian world I was slowly losing touch with. He handled our finances, maintained our growing social connections in Colorado Springs, and made decisions about our future that kept our life moving forward, even when I was thousands of miles away, dealing with life and death situations daily. When I was injured during my third deployment, a roadside bomb that left me with hearing damage and a traumatic brain injury that ended my combat career. Jake flew to Germany to meet me at the military hospital. He spent 2 weeks learning about my injuries, talking to doctors about my recovery timeline, and researching civilian treatment options that would help me transition back to full health. His support during my medical evaluation and retirement process was everything I could have asked for from a military spouse. Jake attended every appointment, took notes during consultations I was too medicated to follow clearly, and advocated for my veteran benefits with the same attention to detail he brought to his construction projects. By the time I was medically retired as a staff sergeant with full disability benefits and an honorable discharge, Jake had already begun planning our post-military life together. He'd researched career opportunities for veterans with my engineering background, identified potential locations where we could buy our dream house, and started conversations about the family we'd been postponing until my service commitment was complete. We bought our house in the foothills 6 months before my final deployment, a beautiful property with mountain views and space for the children we planned to start trying for as soon as I returned home for good. Jake handled the entire purchasing process while I was overseas, sending photos and video tours that let me participate in choosing our future home despite being deployed. The house represented everything we'd worked toward together: stability, beauty, and space for the next chapter of our lives. Jake filled it with furniture we'd chosen together during video calls, creating a home that would welcome me back from war and support our transition to civilian married life. Looking back, I realized that Jake's support during my military career was so comprehensive, so perfectly calibrated to what I needed, that I never questioned whether he was getting everything he needed from our relationship. I was so grateful for his patience with deployments, his understanding of military demands, and his commitment to our future that I never considered whether he might be growing tired of always being the supportive spouse waiting for his wife to come home from more important priorities. The man who seemed so perfectly suited to military marriage might have been the kind of person who thrived on being needed, on being the stable foundation that allowed someone else to pursue dangerous and demanding work. But when that dynamic was about to change, when I was finally coming home to focus on our relationship and our future together, maybe the reality of sharing his life with someone who was no longer deployed became less appealing than the romance of supporting someone from a distance. The first crack in my perfect military marriage appeared 3 days after I returned home, during what should have been our romantic reunion dinner at Romano's Italian Bistro, the same restaurant where Jake had taken me for our first official date 8 years earlier. I'd been looking forward to this evening for months. Real conversation over wine and pasta, catching up on everything we'd missed during video calls, and planning our future as full-time civilians finally living in the same time zone. But as Jake cut his chicken parmesan and told me about a recent project delay at work, I noticed he was wearing a watch I'd never seen before. It was expensive, a Tag Heuer chronograph that cost more than his monthly salary, and when I complimented it, he paused for just a fraction of a second too long before explaining that he'd bought it to celebrate a promotion he'd received while I was deployed. The pause itself wasn't unusual. After multiple combat deployments, you learn to recognize micro-expressions and behavioral tells that indicate deception or stress. In Afghanistan, that skill kept me alive when dealing with local contractors who might be feeding information to insurgents. At my homecoming dinner, it told me that my husband was lying about something as simple as where he'd gotten a watch. Jake had never been interested in expensive accessories. During our entire relationship, he'd worn the same basic Timex digital watch he'd owned since college, claiming he didn't see the point in spending money on something that just told time. The man sitting across from me, wearing a watch that cost $3,000 and explaining it away as a celebration purchase, didn't match the practical, budget-conscious project manager I'd married. I filed the observation away and continued, enjoying our dinner, but my training had been activated. In the military, you learn that small inconsistencies often indicate larger problems, and you investigate them systematically rather than dismissing them as paranoia. If Jake was lying about something as trivial as a watch, there might be other Deceptions I needed to identify. Over the next week, I began conducting what the Army had taught me to call environmental assessment, cataloging changes in familiar territory to identify potential threats or anomalies. Our house had subtle differences that Jake's explanations didn't quite cover. The refrigerator contained expensive organic foods he'd never purchased before, including Greek yogurt brands and specialty cheeses that suggested someone with different dietary preferences had been shopping. The bathroom had new toiletries, higher-end moisturizers, different brand of toothpaste, and a bottle of prenatal vitamins tucked behind my old prescription bottles. When I asked about the vitamins, Jake explained that his sister Sarah had stayed with us for a few days during her visit to Colorado Springs, and she must have forgotten them. It was a reasonable explanation, except that Sarah had been trying to get pregnant for 2 years and had mentioned during our last video call that she'd finally given up and was considering adoption instead. Sarah wouldn't have been taking prenatal vitamins, and she definitely wouldn't have forgotten something so expensive and emotionally significant. The most telling change was in Jake's personal habits and routines. The man I'd married had been predictably consistent. Same breakfast every morning, same route to work, same evening routine of construction industry news and ESPN highlights. The Jake who'd picked me up from the airport was subtly different in ways that suggested significant external influence over the past several months. He'd started using a different cologne, something expensive and sophisticated that replaced the drugstore aftershave he'd worn for years. His hair was styled differently, cut by someone who charged more than the barbershop he'd frequented throughout our relationship. His clothes were more fashionable, including several shirts and a jacket I'd never seen that were clearly more expensive than his usual work wardrobe. Most significantly, Jake's relationship with his phone had completely changed. Throughout our marriage, he'd been casual about communication, leaving his phone on counters, answering calls in front of me, and never seeming concerned about privacy. The Jake who returned from picking me up at the airport kept his phone face down during meals, took calls in other rooms, and had added security features that prevented notifications from displaying on the lock screen. When I asked about the increased security, Jake explained that his company had implemented new protocols for project managers who handled sensitive client information. It sounded reasonable until I remembered that he'd never mentioned these protocols during our regular communication, and he'd been handling sensitive projects throughout our entire relationship without ever being concerned about phone security. My suspicions crystallized during my second week home when I found concrete evidence that Jake was lying about his daily activities. He'd told me he was working late on a project proposal, but when I drove past the Pinnacle construction office at 8 p.m. to surprise him with dinner, the parking lot was empty and the building was dark. His truck wasn't there, and when I called his phone, it went directly to voicemail. Jake arrived home at nearly midnight, claiming the meeting had run longer than expected, and they'd moved to a client's office across town. When I asked which client, he provided details about a restaurant renovation project that sounded specific and believable. But Jake had never worked on restaurant projects. His specialty was commercial office buildings and retail developments. The level of detail he provided about commercial kitchen requirements and health department regulations suggested he'd either researched the subject extensively or had personal experience with restaurant environments. That's when I made the tactical decision that would define everything that followed. Instead of confronting Jake about the inconsistencies I'd identified, I was going to conduct a comprehensive intelligence operation on my own husband. Military training had taught me that emotional reactions compromise operational effectiveness, but systematic information gathering provides the foundation for strategic action. I began with financial surveillance, something I could accomplish without Jake's knowledge because I had access to all our accounts through the online banking systems we'd set up during my deployments. What I discovered was a pattern of expenditures that told a clear story about Jake's activities during my final deployment. Credit card statements showed regular charges at restaurants I'd never heard of, always for 2 people, always during hours, when Jake had told me he was working late or attending business meetings. There were hotel charges in Denver and Colorado Springs, expensive wine purchases, and jewelry store transactions that hadn't resulted in gifts for me. Most damning were recurring charges at an upscale florist, weekly flower purchases that had continued throughout my deployment, without any flowers appearing in our house. The financial evidence painted a picture of someone maintaining a parallel relationship with considerable expense and effort. Jake had been living a double life that required significant time and money, suggesting this wasn't a casual affair, but a sustained romantic relationship with someone he was seriously invested in impressing. I expanded my investigation to include digital surveillance, using skills I'd learned during military intelligence training to monitor Jake's online activities without his knowledge. His social media accounts had privacy settings that prevented me from seeing his recent activity, but I could track his location through shared calendar systems and find tagged photos from friends who hadn't adjusted their privacy settings. What I discovered was that Jake had been living an entirely different social life during my deployment. Photos from friends' accounts showed him at parties and events I'd never heard about, often with the same young woman who appeared consistently, in group settings but never as an obviously romantic partner. She was blonde, petite, and probably in her mid-20s. Everything I wasn't as a 33-year-old combat veteran with short brown hair and scars from my overseas service. Her name was Megan Torres, and she worked as a marketing coordinator for a luxury real estate company in Colorado Springs. Her social media presence painted her as everything I'd never been: feminine, social, focused on fashion and lifestyle content, rather than military service and engineering projects. She posted frequently about wine tastings, yoga classes, and shopping trips, creating a picture of someone whose life was built around leisure and aesthetics, rather than duty and sacrifice. Jake appeared in enough of her social media posts to make their relationship obvious to anyone paying attention, but always in group settings that provided plausible deniability if questioned. They weren't holding hands or kissing in photos, but their body language and consistent proximity told a clear story about intimacy and comfort with each other. The most revealing discovery came when I found their shared Pinterest account, something Jake had never mentioned and wouldn't have created himself. The account featured boards for dream apartment, date night ideas, and future plans that showcased a life they were building together. The apartment board featured luxury properties in Colorado Springs, the date ideas included romantic restaurants and weekend getaways, and the future plans board had pins about engagement rings, wedding venues, and honeymoon destinations. Jake wasn't just having an affair with Megan Torres. He was planning a future with her that directly conflicted with the future he'd been promising me throughout my military service. While I was deployed in combat zones believing I was protecting the life we'd built together, Jake was actively constructing a different life with someone who represented everything military service had prevented me from being. The betrayal went deeper than simple adultery. Jake had used my absence to explore what his life might look like with someone who wasn't constrained by military obligations, someone who could focus entirely on being the kind of partner he apparently preferred. Megan was available for spontaneous dinners, weekend trips, and social events that my deployment schedule had never allowed. She could be feminine and decorative in ways that my combat training and military bearing had never emphasized. 3 weeks after my return, I found the evidence that confirmed everything I'd suspected. Jake had left his laptop open while he showered, and I saw a text message notification from Sunshine, obviously his pet name for Megan, that read, "Can't wait to see you tonight. Wear the cologne I bought you." The cologne I'd noticed. The expensive gifts. The changed behavior patterns. Everything suddenly made perfect sense. Jake hadn't just been unfaithful during my deployment. He'd been auditioning for a completely different life with someone who could give him things that military marriage had never provided. But instead of confronting him immediately like most betrayed wives would have done, I made a decision that would define everything that followed. I was going to continue my intelligence operation until I had complete documentation of their relationship, And then I was going to systematically destroy the perfect life Jake thought he was building with Megan Torres. The woman he'd married might have been vulnerable to his deception, but the soldier he'd betrayed was about to teach him why you never underestimate someone who's survived multiple combat deployments and knows exactly how to plan strategic operations against enemy targets. Jake and Megan had no idea that their perfect romance was about to become a perfectly orchestrated nightmare, designed and executed by someone who'd learned tactical planning from the best military minds in the world and had never failed to complete a mission once she'd identified her objective. The investigation phase of Operation Homewrecker, as I'd begun calling it in my tactical planning notes, required the same methodical approach I'd used to identify and neutralize threats during my combat deployments. Over the next 6 weeks, I systematically documented every aspect of Jake and Megan's relationship while maintaining the facade of an oblivious wife adjusting to civilian life. My first priority was establishing comprehensive surveillance without compromising my position. I created a detailed schedule of Jake's actual activities versus his reported activities, tracking the discrepancies that would help me predict when and where he was meeting Megan. Jake claimed to work late 3 nights a week and attend construction industry networking events on weekends. But his actual pattern revealed a more personal schedule built around romantic encounters. Tuesday evenings were dinner dates, always at upscale restaurants in different parts of Colorado Springs, where they were less likely to encounter Jake's professional contacts or my military friends. I confirmed this by following him on 2 separate occasions, parking my truck in locations that provided clear sightlines while remaining undetected. The first time, I watched them share wine and hold hands across the table at Bella Vista, an expensive Italian restaurant where Jake had never taken me despite 8 years together. The second time, I documented them at The Summit, a steakhouse that specialized in romantic dinners and cost more per meal than Jake typically spent on groceries for a week. Thursday evenings were apparently their casual time together, usually at Megan's apartment in a trendy complex near downtown Colorado Springs. I identified her address through property records and confirmed that Jake's truck was parked there consistently on Thursday evenings from approximately 6 p.m. to 11 p.m. The timing suggested intimate dinners and private time rather than group, social activities, or work-related meetings. Weekend patterns were more elaborate and revealing. Jake had been telling me he was attending construction industry conferences or networking events, but his actual weekends involved romantic getaways, with Megan to locations within driving distance of Colorado Springs. I discovered this by tracking his credit card usage and cross-referencing it with Megan's social media posts, which had been carefully curated to avoid obviously romantic content but still documented their shared experiences. One weekend, Jake claimed to be attending a project management seminar in Denver, while actually spending 2 days with Megan at a luxury resort in Vail. His credit card showed charges for spa treatments, expensive dinners, and hotel room service, while Megan's Instagram featured carefully cropped photos of mountain views, wine glasses, and romantic sunset shots that didn't include Jake, but were clearly taken from the same location where he was, spending company money. Another weekend, Jake's supposed client meeting in Durango corresponded with charges at a romantic bed and breakfast where Megan had posted photos of hiking trails and artisanal breakfast presentations. The pattern revealed that Jake was using his construction industry connections and company expense account to justify romantic trips with his girlfriend, essentially stealing from Pinnacle Construction to fund his affair. The financial component of my investigation revealed the most damaging evidence about the scope and seriousness of Jake's betrayal. Through careful analysis of our joint accounts and his individual credit cards, I calculated that Jake had spent over $18,000 on his relationship with Megan during my final deployment. This wasn't casual infidelity. It was a sustained romantic investment that required significant financial commitment and elaborate deception. The jewelry store charges alone totaled over $4,000, including a diamond bracelet, pearl earrings, and a promise ring that Jake, had never mentioned to me, these weren't impulsive purchases, but carefully selected gifts that suggested a long-term relationship and serious romantic intentions. The promise ring, in particular, indicated that Jake was making commitments to Megan that directly contradicted his marriage vows to me. Restaurant charges revealed that Jake was taking Megan to establishments he'd never mentioned to me, despite claiming to be a food enthusiast who enjoyed trying new places. The Summit, Bella Vista, the Copper Kettle, and Augustine's were all restaurants Jake had researched, made reservations for, and returned to multiple times with Megan, but had never suggested for our own date nights. This pattern suggested he was compartmentalizing his life, reserving certain experiences and locations for his relationship with Megan, while maintaining different, less elaborate activities with me. Hotel and travel expenses were the most revealing aspect of Jake's financial betrayal. Beyond the romantic getaways he'd disguised as work trips, I discovered that Jake had been paying for regular hotel rooms in Colorado Springs when he claimed to be working late. These weren't business meetings. They were afternoon encounters with Megan that Jake was funding through our joint accounts while lying about his whereabouts. The pattern of financial deception extended to everyday expenses that revealed how integrated Megan had become in Jake's daily life. Grocery charges showed he was purchasing expensive wine, specialty foods, and organic produce that never appeared in our house, suggesting he was either cooking for Megan or contributing to her household expenses. Clothing purchases included items I'd never seen him wear, indicating he was building a wardrobe specifically for his time with Megan. Most damaging was the discovery that Jake had opened a separate checking account without my knowledge, using it to fund larger expenses related to his affair. The account, which I discovered through credit monitoring services, contained deposits from our joint savings and had been used to pay for the most expensive aspects of his relationship with Megan, including the Vail Resort weekend and several pieces of jewelry. Digital surveillance provided additional layers of evidence that confirmed the seriousness of Jake's emotional investment in Megan. Through careful monitoring of shared calendar systems and location services, I identified patterns that revealed Jake was prioritizing his relationship with Megan over professional obligations and family commitments. Jake had been calling in sick to work to spend time with Megan, claiming family emergencies or medical appointments while actually taking her on day trips to locations around Colorado. His employer-provided phone showed location data that contradicted his reported activities, placing him at tourist destinations, shopping centers, and recreational areas during hours when he claimed to be at work or in business meetings. Email surveillance, conducted through shared accounts Jake had forgotten to secure, revealed the emotional depth of his betrayal. Messages between Jake and Megan discussed their future together in terms that made clear Jake was planning to leave our marriage. They weren't talking about a casual affair. They were planning a life together that included shared living arrangements, financial integration, and long-term romantic commitment. The emails revealed that Jake had been researching divorce attorneys, calculating the financial implications of ending our marriage, and discussing timeline strategies with Megan about when and how to transition from his current life to their shared future. Jake hadn't just been unfaithful, he'd been actively planning to abandon our marriage while maintaining the facade of a loving husband during my transition from military service. Megan's role in the relationship was more calculating than I'd initially assumed. Her emails showed she was fully aware that Jake was married to an active duty service member, and she'd been encouraging him to prioritize their relationship over his marriage obligations. She wasn't an innocent woman who'd been deceived about Jake's availability. She was actively participating in the systematic destruction of our marriage while I was deployed in combat zones. Her messages revealed that she viewed military marriage as inherently unstable and Jake's relationship with me as an obligation he'd outgrown rather than a commitment he should honor. She consistently encouraged Jake to pursue his own happiness rather than maintaining loyalty to someone who was frequently absent due to military service, positioning herself as the better romantic choice for someone seeking stability and availability. Be cute? Most devastating discovery came through social media surveillance that revealed how public Jake and Megan's relationship had become within certain social circles. While they maintained discretion around Jake's work colleagues and my military friends, they were openly functioning as a couple within Megan's social network and among mutual friends who were unaware of Jake's marriage. Photo evidence from various social media accounts showed Jake and Megan attending parties, concerts, and social events as an established couple, with Jake being introduced to new people as Megan's boyfriend rather than as a married man having an affair. They'd created an entire parallel social life where their relationship was legitimate and public, suggesting they were preparing for a transition to open cohabitation once Jake ended our marriage. The investigation phase concluded when I discovered Jake and Megan's shared Pinterest account and Google Drive folder, which contained detailed plans for their future together. The Pinterest boards included apartment hunting, wedding planning, and honeymoon destinations, while the Google Drive contained spreadsheets calculating the financial benefits of Jake divorcing me and combining households with Megan. They'd researched Colorado divorce law, calculated potential alimony obligations, and analyzed the financial advantages of Jake's veteran spouse benefits versus the income potential of Megan's career in luxury real estate. Their planning was comprehensive and mercenary, treating our marriage as a financial obligation to be minimized rather than an emotional commitment to be honored. By the end of my investigation phase, I had documented evidence that Jake's affair wasn't a moment of weakness or temporary lapse in judgment. It was a calculated replacement of our marriage with a relationship he found more appealing and convenient. He'd invested significant time, money, and emotional energy in building a life with Megan while maintaining the facade of a devoted husband during my military service. The betrayal was complete and systematic, involving financial theft, emotional manipulation, and elaborate deception that had been ongoing for months before my return from deployment. Jake hadn't just been unfaithful, he'd been conducting a comprehensive exit strategy from our marriage while using my absence to explore what his life might look like with someone who represented everything military service had prevented me from being. The evidence I'd gathered was overwhelming and undeniable, providing the foundation for the strategic response I was about to implement. Jake and Megan thought they were building their perfect life together, but they had no idea that every aspect of their relationship had been documented by someone who understood tactical planning better than they understood the consequences of betraying a combat veteran. The intelligence gathering phase was complete. Now it was time to move to operational planning and begin systematically dismantling their fairy tale romance piece by piece. The strategic planning phase of my operation began the same way I'd approach any complex military mission, with clear objectives, detailed intelligence analysis, and systematic identification of enemy vulnerabilities. After 6 weeks of comprehensive surveillance, I had enough evidence to destroy Jake and Megan's relationship through immediate confrontation, but that would have been emotionally satisfying rather than strategically effective. Instead, I was going to use everything I'd learned about their weaknesses to systematically dismantle their perfect life while they remained completely unaware that I was orchestrating their destruction. My primary objective wasn't revenge. It was comprehensive neutralization of the threat they posed to my future security and well-being. Jake's betrayal had demonstrated that he was willing to steal from our joint finances, lie about his activities, and plan to abandon our marriage, while using my military service as cover for his deception. Megan had shown herself to be equally calculating, actively encouraging Jake to prioritize their relationship over his marriage obligations while benefiting from money and attention that rightfully belonged to me. Simple confrontation would have given them the opportunity to control damage, coordinate their responses, and potentially salvage their relationship while painting me as an unstable military veteran who couldn't handle civilian marriage. But strategic destruction would force them to face consequences they couldn't anticipate, manipulate, or escape, while demonstrating that betraying a combat engineer was the worst tactical decision they'd ever made. I began by analyzing their individual, vulnerabilities and the weak points in their relationship that could be exploited without revealing my involvement. Jake's primary weakness was his need to maintain his professional reputation while funding an expensive lifestyle he couldn't actually afford on his project manager's salary. Megan's vulnerability was her social media presence and her career in luxury real estate, both of which depended on maintaining an image of success and stability that could be undermined through carefully orchestrated circumstances. Their relationship's fundamental weakness was built on deception and financial resources that didn't actually belong to Jake. They'd constructed their romance using stolen money, borrowed time, and elaborate lies that required constant maintenance and coordination. Any disruption to those foundational elements would create cascading problems they wouldn't be able to solve without revealing the full scope of their deception to people whose opinions mattered to their individual careers and social standing. My first tactical decision was to ensure that Jake's affair would become financially unsustainable without him understanding why his resources were suddenly limited. I began by systematically closing off his access to the joint accounts and credit lines he'd been using to fund his relationship with Megan, but in ways that appeared to be routine financial management rather than strategic sabotage. I consolidated our joint savings into accounts that required both signatures for withdrawals, explaining to Jake that I'd learned about better investment opportunities through military financial counseling and wanted to maximize our earning potential as we transitioned to civilian life. Jake couldn't object without revealing that he needed unrestricted access to our money for reasons he couldn't explain. So he agreed to the changes while obviously frustrated about losing his easy funding source for romantic dinners and weekend getaways. I also refinanced our mortgage and car loans to reduce our monthly payments, but structured the new agreements so that any additional debt or credit applications would require my co-signature and full financial disclosure. This effectively eliminated Jake's ability to finance his affair through new credit lines, while appearing to be responsible financial planning that benefited our household's long-term stability. The immediate impact was that Jake's elaborate, romantic gestures became financially impossible without using traceable funds or revealing his need for money he couldn't explain. His credit card statements showed a dramatic reduction in restaurant charges, hotel expenses, and gift purchases, suggesting that his relationship with Megan was already experiencing strain from reduced financial resources. My second strategic focus was systematically undermining the social and professional networks that enabled Jake and Megan to maintain their parallel relationship. Through careful research, I identified mutual friends, professional contacts, and social venues where they felt comfortable operating as a couple, then began introducing complications that would make those environments uncomfortable or unavailable. Started attending Jake's professional networking events, something I'd never done during my military service, but could now justify as part of my transition to civilian life and my interest in supporting his career advancement. My presence at these events made it impossible for Jake to bring Megan or to openly socialize with her if she attended independently, effectively eliminating venues where they'd previously been able to function as a couple within certain social circles. At the Colorado Construction Association mixer in February, I watched Jake's discomfort as he tried to navigate conversations with colleagues while knowing that Megan was somewhere in the same venue but unable to acknowledge their relationship publicly. His stress was obvious to anyone paying attention, and several of his professional contacts commented on his distracted behavior and lack of enthusiasm for events he'd previously enjoyed. I also began cultivating relationships with people in Megan's professional network, positioning myself as a military veteran interested in real estate investment opportunities as part of my transition to civilian life. This gave me legitimate reasons to visit luxury real estate open houses, attend industry events, and engage with professionals in Megan's field, creating situations where she might encounter me unexpectedly and feel uncomfortable about her professional environment overlapping with her personal deception. The psychological pressure of these tactics was designed to make Jake and Megan feel increasingly isolated and paranoid about maintaining their secret relationship. They couldn't enjoy the same venues, social events, or professional environments without worrying about unexpected complications or awkward encounters that might reveal their affair to people whose opinions mattered to their careers. My third strategic approach involved creating artificial obstacles and setbacks that would test the strength of their relationship under pressure. Military experience had taught me that romantic relationships built on deception and convenience often collapse when faced with realistic challenges, so I began introducing complications that would force Jake and Megan to decide how much they were actually willing to sacrifice for each other. I researched Megan's career advancement timeline and discovered that she was competing for a promotion to senior marketing coordinator that would significantly increase her income and professional status. The promotion required client presentations and project management skills that were outside her current expertise, so I anonymously sent her supervisor detailed information about marketing workshops and professional development opportunities. That would require evening and weekend commitments during the exact times when Megan usually spent time with Jake. The workshops were legitimate and valuable for Megan's career, but attending them would eliminate her availability for the Tuesday, dinners and Thursday evening visits that had become routine in their relationship. She had to choose between advancing her career and maintaining her romantic schedule with Jake, creating tension in their relationship that neither of them could resolve without making sacrifices. Simultaneously, I used my connections within the construction industry to ensure that Jake would face increased scrutiny regarding his expense reports and time management. Through a casual conversation with the wife of Pinnacle Construction's owner, someone I'd met at military spouse events, I mentioned my concern that Jake had been working excessive hours lately and seemed stressed about projects that were requiring unusual amounts of travel and client entertainment. This innocent-sounding concern prompted Jake's supervisor to review his recent expense reports and project timelines more carefully, leading to questions about charges that Jake couldn't fully explain without revealing his personal use of company resources. The increased oversight made it impossible for Jake to continue using work as cover for his romantic activities with Megan, forcing him to either reduce their time together or find alternative explanations for his availability. My fourth tactical element involved systematically disrupting the practical logistics that enabled Jake and Megan to maintain their affair without detection. I began creating scheduling conflicts and social obligations that would interfere with their established routines, making it increasingly difficult for them to coordinate private time together. I volunteered for evening activities that would require Jake's participation as my supportive husband, including veteran support groups, community volunteer projects, and social events with military families in the Colorado Springs area. These commitments were meaningful to me personally and professionally valuable for Jake's community reputation, but they conflicted with his Tuesday dinner dates and Thursday evening visits to Megan's apartment. Jake couldn't refuse to accompany me without appearing unsupportive of my military service and transition to civilian life, but attending these events eliminated his availability for maintaining his regular schedule with Megan. The resulting scheduling pressure forced them to attempt more spontaneous meetings or reduce their time together, creating stress and unpredictability in a relationship that had been built on routine and careful planning. I also began planning weekend activities that would require Jake's presence and participation, including house projects, family visits, and social gatherings with couples from our established friend network. These weren't demands or ultimatums. They were reasonable requests from a wife who wanted to spend time with her husband and rebuild their civilian life together. But they systematically eliminated Jake's availability for the romantic getaways and extended private time that had been central to his relationship with Megan. The cumulative effect of these tactical approaches was that Jake and Megan's relationship began experiencing strain and complications they couldn't solve through better planning or increased effort. Their financial resources were limited, their social venues were compromised, their career obligations were conflicting with their romantic schedule, and their practical logistics were constantly disrupted by circumstances that appeared to be coincidental but were actually carefully orchestrated. By the end of March, my surveillance indicated that Jake and Megan were arguing more frequently, spending less time together, and struggling to maintain the romantic intensity that had characterized their relationship during my deployment. Jake's stress was becoming obvious in his behavior at home, where he was increasingly irritable, distracted, and defensive about his activities and schedule. Most importantly, they were beginning to question whether their relationship was worth the complications and sacrifices it required, exactly the psychological state I needed them to reach before implementing the final phase of my operation. They'd built their romance on convenience, excitement, and stolen resources, but none of those foundations could survive sustained pressure and realistic obstacles. The strategic planning phase was complete, and Jake and Megan were perfectly positioned for the systematic destruction of their perfect life. They still had no idea that their difficulties were being orchestrated by someone who understood tactical planning better than they understood the consequences of betraying a combat veteran. But they were about to learn that lesson in ways they would never forget. The public revelation phase of my operation required perfect timing, maximum impact, and undeniable evidence that would destroy Jake and Megan's relationship while exposing their deception to everyone who mattered in their professional and social lives. After months of careful planning and strategic pressure, they were emotionally vulnerable and logistically strained, making them perfect targets for the comprehensive exposure I was about to orchestrate. I chose Pinnacle Construction's annual awards banquet as the venue for my revelation, a decision that would maximize the professional damage to Jake while ensuring that Megan's real estate industry contacts would witness the destruction of their carefully maintained facade. The banquet was scheduled for the first Saturday in April, and Jake had been planning to attend with me as his supportive military spouse, giving me the perfect platform to demonstrate exactly what kind of support he actually deserved. The event would host over 200 guests, including Jake's colleagues, supervisors, clients, and their spouses, as well as representatives from related industries throughout Colorado Springs. Megan's supervisor from Premier Luxury Realty would be there as a sponsor representative, along with several other real estate professionals who knew Megan personally and professionally. The audience would include everyone whose opinions mattered to both Jake's career advancement and Megan's professional reputation. 3 weeks before the banquet, I began the final phase of my evidence compilation, creating a comprehensive presentation that would document Jake's affair with undeniable proof while revealing the scope of his financial theft and professional misconduct. The presentation needed to be devastating but factual, emotional but professional, and comprehensive enough that Jake couldn't minimize or explain away the evidence I was about to reveal. I organized the evidence into categories that would resonate with different segments of the audience. For Jake's professional colleagues, I documented his misuse of company resources, false expense reports, and lies about client meetings that were actually romantic encounters with Megan. For the financial professionals in attendance, I calculated the total cost of Jake's affair and demonstrated how he'd used our joint accounts to fund his relationship with another woman. For the military families present, I framed Jake's betrayal in terms of honor, integrity, and the trust that service members place in their civilian spouses. The presentation opened with side-by-side photos of Jake and Megan from their Pinterest account and social media posts, showing them as a happy couple planning their future together, followed immediately by photos of Jake and me at our military wedding and during my deployment send-offs. The visual contrast would make Jake's betrayal immediately obvious to everyone in the room, while establishing the timeline that showed he'd been deceiving me throughout my military service. I included financial records showing Jake's spending patterns with clear documentation of restaurant charges, hotel expenses, jewelry purchases, and travel costs that totaled over $22,000 during my final deployment. The evidence showed that Jake had essentially been living a double life, funded by money that belonged to both of us, stealing from our joint savings to finance his affair while I was serving my country in combat zones. The most damaging evidence involved Jake's professional misconduct, including expense reports that claimed business meetings during hours when he was actually with Megan, mileage reimbursements for personal trips, and client entertainment charges for romantic dinners that had nothing to do with Pinnacle Construction's business interests. This evidence would expose Jake not just as an unfaithful husband, but as an employee who'd been stealing from his company to fund his personal relationship. I also included screenshots of email communications between Jake and Megan that revealed their planning to divorce and marry each other, complete with financial calculations about how much money Jake would save by ending our marriage and combining households with Megan. These messages showed that Jake's betrayal wasn't impulsive infidelity, but calculated abandonment of his marriage, obligations in favor of what he perceived as a better financial and romantic opportunity. The presentation concluded with documentation of Jake's lies to me about his activities, including false claims about work meetings, construction conferences, and client obligations that were actually romantic encounters with Megan. I included audio recordings of Jake lying to me about his whereabouts, obtained through legal surveillance, methods that would be admissible in divorce proceedings and professional misconduct investigations. On the evening of the banquet, I prepared myself with the same attention to detail I'd used for military operations where lives depended on flawless execution. I wore my dress uniform, complete with combat ribbons and service medals that would remind everyone present of my military service and the sacrifices I'd made for my country while Jake was betraying our marriage. The uniform also served as a visual reminder of the honor and integrity that Jake had abandoned in favor of personal gratification. Jake seemed nervous during our drive to the banquet venue, asking repeatedly about my plans for the evening and whether I was comfortable attending such a large professional event. His anxiety suggested that he sensed something was different about my behavior, but he couldn't identify the specific threat or take action to prevent whatever he feared might happen. The banquet began with cocktails and networking, during which I identified key individuals who would be most affected by the revelation I was about to make. I located Jake's supervisor, David Morrison, and introduced myself as a military veteran interested in supporting local business leaders who employed veterans. I found Megan's supervisor, Patricia Chen, and engaged her in conversation about real estate opportunities for military families transitioning to civilian life. Most importantly, I identified several influential guests whose opinions would carry significant weight in the local business community, including the president of the Colorado Springs Chamber of Commerce, the editor of the local business journal, and several prominent business owners who contracted with both Pinnacle Construction and Premier Luxury Realty. During dinner, I maintained normal conversation with Jake and the other guests at our table, discussing my military service, our plans for my transition to civilian life, and Jake's career advancement at Pinnacle Construction. Jake seemed to relax as the evening progressed normally, clearly believing that whatever he'd been worried about was not going to materialize. The awards portion of the evening began with recognition of outstanding employees, successful projects, and community contributions. Jake received an award for his project management on a major commercial development, and I applauded enthusiastically as he accepted the recognition and thanked his colleagues for their support. His speech included gratitude to his loving wife who has served our country with distinction, making my upcoming revelation even more dramatically effective. When the formal awards concluded, the event moved to open networking and social conversation, which provided the perfect opportunity for my presentation. I approached the microphone that had been used for the awards ceremony and asked for everyone's attention, explaining that I had an important announcement to make about my husband's character and professional conduct. The room quieted as I began my presentation, starting with my military service and the sacrifices that military families make for their country. I explained that service members depend on their civilian spouses to maintain their homes, manage their finances, and preserve their marriages during deployments, and that this trust is fundamental to military readiness and national security. Then revealed that during my final deployment, Jake had violated that trust by conducting an affair with Megan Torres, a real estate professional who was present at the banquet as a sponsor representative. The announcement sent visible shockwaves through the audience as people turned to locate Megan in the crowd and began whispering among themselves about the implications of what I was revealing. I displayed the side-by-side photos of Jake and Megan as a couple alongside photos of Jake and me during my military service, making the timeline and scope of his betrayal immediately obvious to everyone present. The visual evidence eliminated any possibility that Jake could claim misunderstanding or minimize the seriousness of his actions. The financial evidence I presented next showed that Jake had spent over $22,000 of our joint money on his affair, including romantic dinners, weekend getaways, expensive gifts, and hotel rooms that he'd charged to company accounts as business expenses. The audience of business professionals immediately understood the implications of Jake's financial misconduct and the liability it created for Pinnacle Construction. I revealed Jake's false expense reports, showing specific examples of romantic dinners with Megan that Jake had claimed as client entertainment, personal trips that he'd charged as business travel, and mileage reimbursements for driving to Megan's apartment that he'd reported as client meetings. The evidence demonstrated that Jake had been systematically stealing from his employer to fund his affair while lying to his supervisors about his activities and whereabouts. The email evidence I displayed showed Jake and Megan planning their future together, including calculations about divorcing me and combining households to maximize their financial benefits. The messages revealed that Jake's affair wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment, but a calculated replacement of his marriage with what he perceived as a more advantageous relationship. Throughout my presentation, I maintained the same professional composure I'd used during military briefings, presenting facts without emotional commentary and allowing the evidence to speak for itself. Jake sat frozen at our table, unable to leave without drawing more attention to himself, but clearly devastated by the comprehensive exposure of his deception. Megan had attempted to leave the venue during my presentation, but I'd anticipated this possibility and arranged for the doors to be monitored by military friends who ensured that key witnesses remained present until my revelation was complete. Her obvious distress and attempt to flee only reinforced the accuracy of my accusations and the guilt of both parties. The immediate aftermath of my presentation was chaos as guests processed what they'd witnessed and began discussing the implications among themselves. Jake's colleagues were clearly shocked by the evidence of his professional misconduct, while Megan's real estate industry contacts were obviously concerned about the damage to her professional reputation and their association with someone involved in such a public scandal. David Morrison, Jake's supervisor, approached me immediately after my presentation to request copies of the financial evidence I'd presented, explaining that Pinnacle Construction would need to conduct an internal investigation of Jake's expense reports and potentially terminate his employment if the evidence confirmed systematic theft of company resources. Patricia Chen, Megan's supervisor, sought me out to understand the timeline of Megan's relationship with Jake and whether it had affected her professional performance or created conflicts of interest in her real estate transactions. The conversation made clear that Megan's career advancement would be significantly impacted by her association with Jake's professional misconduct. Several other business leaders requested copies of my evidence, explaining that they wanted to understand the full scope of Jake's deception before making decisions about future professional relationships with either Jake or Megan. The revelation had effectively destroyed both of their professional reputations within Colorado Springs' interconnected business community. As Jake and I left the banquet, he was visibly shaken and repeatedly asking how I'd obtained the evidence I'd presented. His questions revealed that he still didn't fully understand the scope of my investigation or the strategic planning that had led to his public exposure. He was focused on damage control rather than accepting responsibility for his actions. Exactly the response I'd anticipated from someone who demonstrated such poor judgment and lack of integrity. The public revelation phase of my operation was complete, and Jake and Megan's perfect life had been systematically destroyed in front of everyone whose opinions mattered to their professional and social standing. They could no longer maintain the facade of their relationship, and the consequences of their deception would follow them throughout their careers and personal lives in Colorado Springs. The immediate aftermath of my public revelation at the Pinnacle construction banquet unfolded with the systematic efficiency I'd anticipated, as the professional and social consequences of Jake and Megan's exposed affair rippled through Colorado Springs' interconnected business community. Within hours of the event, both of their carefully constructed lives began collapsing in ways they couldn't control, minimize, or escape. Jake's attempts at damage control began during our silent drive home from the banquet, his hands shaking, as he gripped the steering wheel and repeatedly asked how I'd obtained the evidence I'd presented. His questions revealed that he still didn't fully comprehend the scope of my investigation or the strategic planning that had led to his public humiliation. Instead of accepting responsibility for his actions, Jake was focused on understanding my methods and identifying ways to minimize the consequences he was about to face. "Rebecca, we need to talk about how you got access to my personal information," Jake said as we pulled into our driveway, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "Some of those documents were private communications, and there might be legal issues with how you obtained them." His response confirmed everything I'd understood about his character throughout our marriage. Even faced with undeniable evidence of his betrayal and theft, Jake's primary concern was whether he could find technicalities to avoid accountability, rather than acknowledging the damage he'd caused to our marriage and his professional relationships. "Everything I presented tonight was obtained through legal methods," I replied calmly, using the same tone I'd employed during military briefings when delivering information that recipients didn't want to hear. "I had legitimate access to our joint financial accounts, shared digital devices, and communication systems that you hadn't properly secured. Your privacy concerns are significantly less important than your professional misconduct and marital betrayal." Jake spent the remainder of the evening making increasingly desperate phone calls to his attorney, his supervisor, and eventually to Megan, trying to coordinate responses and develop strategies for managing the crisis I'd created. His conversations, which I could hear clearly through our shared living space, revealed the extent to which both he and Megan were unprepared for the consequences of their exposed deception. The first professional consequence arrived the following Monday morning when David Morrison called Jake at 6 a.m. to schedule an emergency meeting regarding his employment status with Pinnacle Construction. The conversation, which Jake took in our kitchen while I prepared my morning coffee, made clear that the company was treating his expense report fraud as grounds for immediate termination and potential criminal prosecution. "Jake, the evidence. Your wife presented Saturday night show's systematic misuse of company resources over several months," Morrison said, his voice clearly audible through Jake's phone speaker. "We're conducting a comprehensive audit of your expense reports, travel claims, and client entertainment charges going back 2 years. You need to report to HR this morning with your attorney present." Jake's face went pale as he processed the implications of Morrison's call. His career at Pinnacle Construction wasn't just threatened, it was effectively over, with potential legal consequences that could prevent him from working in project management anywhere in Colorado's construction industry. The professional reputation he'd spent 8 years building was destroyed by a single evening of truth-telling about his personal conduct. The meeting with Pinnacle Construction's Human Resources Department and legal counsel resulted in Jake's immediate suspension without pay pending completion of their internal investigation. By Wednesday, the company had calculated that Jake had stolen over $15,000 through false expense claims and fraudulent travel reimbursements, transforming his employment termination into a potential criminal matter that would require law enforcement involvement. Jake's attempts to minimize his professional misconduct were unsuccessful because the evidence I'd compiled was comprehensive and undeniable. His explanations about administrative errors and misunderstandings were contradicted by email communications, credit card records, and timeline analyses that showed deliberate deception rather than innocent mistakes. The systematic nature of his fraud made it impossible for Pinnacle Construction to treat his actions as isolated incidents or employee policy violations. By Friday of that first week, Jake had been formally terminated for cause, making him ineligible for unemployment benefits and requiring him to repay the stolen funds to avoid criminal prosecution. The company also reported his misconduct to industry regulatory bodies and professional associations, effectively blacklisting him from project management positions throughout Colorado's construction sector. Megan's professional consequences were equally devastating, though they unfolded through different mechanisms that reflected the nature of her career in luxury real estate. Patricia Chen's investigation into Megan's relationship with Jake revealed that she'd been using company resources and client relationships to support her affair, creating conflicts of interest that compromised her professional integrity and potentially violated real estate licensing regulations. The investigation showed that Megan had been meeting Jake during scheduled client appointments, using company time for personal activities while claiming to be conducting business on behalf of Premier Luxury Realty. Her expense reports included charges for romantic dinners with Jake that she'd categorized as client entertainment, and her travel claims included personal trips that she'd disguised as property research and market analysis. More damaging to Megan's career was the discovery that she'd been discussing confidential client information with Jake, potentially violating privacy regulations and fiduciary responsibilities that governed real estate professionals. Several high-net-worth clients had expressed concerns about their personal information being shared outside appropriate professional channels, creating liability issues for Premier Luxury Realty. By the end of the second week following my revelation, Megan had been placed on administrative leave while the Colorado Real Estate Commission investigated her professional conduct. The investigation would determine whether her actions violated licensing requirements and warranted disciplinary action that could affect her ability to work in real estate throughout Colorado. The social consequences for both Jake and Megan were equally comprehensive, as word of their exposed affair and professional misconduct spread through Colorado Springs' interconnected business and social networks. The public nature of my revelation at the industry banquet ensured that their deception became widely known among professionals whose opinions mattered to their career advancement and social standing. Jake's construction industry colleagues began distancing themselves from association with someone who'd been terminated for theft and professional misconduct. Networking events, professional organizations, and social gatherings that had been central to Jake's career development became uncomfortable environments where his presence was unwelcome and his reputation was damaged beyond repair. The Colorado Construction Association revoked Jake's membership following his termination from Pinnacle Construction, eliminating his access to industry events, continuing education opportunities, and professional networking that would be essential for finding new employment. Other professional organizations began reviewing his membership status as word spread about his misconduct and termination. Megan faced similar social isolation as her real estate industry contacts learned about her role in Jake's professional downfall and the ethical violations that had led to her suspension. Luxury real estate in Colorado Springs was a small, competitive market where reputation and client trust were essential for success, and Megan's association with fraud and professional misconduct made her toxic to potential employers and professional partners. The personal relationship between Jake and Megan, which had seemed so perfect when built on stolen money and elaborate deception, began deteriorating rapidly under the pressure of their shared professional destruction. Without the financial resources Jake had been stealing to fund their romance, and facing the stress of potential criminal prosecution and career termination, their connection couldn't survive the realistic challenges of their situation. Jake's increasingly desperate attempts to find new employment were unsuccessful because potential employers in Colorado's construction industry had heard about his termination from Pinnacle Construction and were unwilling to risk association with someone who'd been fired for theft. His applications were rejected quickly, often without interviews, as his professional reputation preceded him throughout the industry. Megan's real estate career was similarly compromised, as luxury agencies were reluctant to hire someone under investigation by the State Licensing Commission and associated with high-profile professional misconduct. Her income dropped to zero. During her administrative leave, eliminating her ability to maintain the expensive lifestyle that had been central to her relationship with Jake. The financial pressure created by their simultaneous unemployment and potential legal costs began, generating conflict between Jake and Megan about responsibility for their situation and strategies for moving forward. Jake blamed Megan for encouraging his professional misconduct, while Megan accused Jake of involving her in his theft without fully explaining the legal risks they were both facing. Their arguments, which I monitored through Jake's phone conversations and social media activity, revealed that their relationship had been built on convenience and financial security rather than genuine emotional connection. When those foundational elements were removed, they had nothing substantial to maintain their bond through the crisis they were both experiencing. Jake's attempts to repair our marriage were equally unsuccessful because they were motivated by desperation rather than genuine remorse or understanding of the damage he'd caused. His apologies focused on the consequences he was facing rather than the betrayal he'd committed, and his proposed solutions involved me helping him manage the crisis rather than him accepting responsibility for his actions. Rebecca, I know I made terrible mistakes, but destroying my career won't fix our marriage, Jake said during one of many conversations where he tried to convince me to provide character references or public statements that might help his professional rehabilitation. We could work through this together if you'd help me manage the legal and financial problems. His requests revealed that Jake still didn't understand the fundamental nature of his betrayal or the reasons why reconciliation was impossible. He viewed our marriage crisis as a problem to be managed rather than consequences of choices he'd made, and he wanted me to prioritize his needs over my own protection and recovery. My response was consistent and clear. Jake had chosen to replace our marriage with his relationship with Megan, and the professional consequences he was facing were the direct result of his own actions rather than my revelation of those actions. I wasn't responsible for managing the crisis he'd created, and I wouldn't sacrifice my own interests to minimize the consequences of his betrayal. By the end of the first month following my public revelation, both Jake and Megan were unemployed, facing potential criminal prosecution, and dealing with the collapse of their relationship under pressures they were unable to manage. Their perfect life together had been completely destroyed, replaced by financial stress, legal problems, and social isolation that would follow them for years, regardless of how they tried to rebuild their careers and reputations. The immediate aftermath phase of my operation was complete, and Jake's betrayal had resulted in consequences that were comprehensive, permanent, and entirely proportional to the systematic deception he'd practiced throughout my military service. The man who'd thought he could replace his military wife with a more convenient partner had learned that betraying a combat veteran was the worst strategic decision he'd ever made. The transformation that followed Jake's professional destruction and the collapse of his relationship with Megan exceeded every expectation I'd harbored about rebuilding my life after betrayal. Within 3 months of my public revelation, I'd not only recovered from the devastation of discovering his affair, but had leveraged my military skills and strategic thinking into opportunities that surpassed anything I'd achieved during my 15 years of Army service. My first breakthrough came through an unexpected connection made at the Pinnacle construction banquet itself. Among the witnesses to Jake's exposure was Colonel Sarah Mitchell, a retired Army Corps of Engineers officer who now worked as a defense contractor, specializing in infrastructure security for military installations. She approached me immediately, after my presentation, expressing admiration for my tactical planning and comprehensive documentation of Jake's misconduct. Staff Sergeant Martinez, that was the most professionally executed personal operation I've witnessed in 30 years of military service, Colonel Mitchell said as we spoke in the hotel lobby after the banquet. Your intelligence gathering, strategic planning, and flawless execution demonstrated skills that are extremely valuable in the private security sector. Colonel Mitchell's company, Fortress Defense Solutions, was seeking experienced military personnel to lead investigations into security breaches, financial fraud, and personnel misconduct at defense facilities throughout the Southwest. My demonstrated ability to conduct comprehensive surveillance, document evidence, and present findings to diverse audiences made me an ideal candidate for their senior investigator position. The job offer came with a salary that was 40% higher than my military pay, comprehensive benefits, and opportunities for advancement that would have been impossible within the Army's rigid promotion structure. More importantly, the work would allow me to use my combat experience and analytical skills in ways that felt meaningful and challenging, rather than settling for civilian employment that underutilized my military training. I accepted the position immediately, recognizing that Colonel Mitchell's offer represented exactly the kind of career opportunity that Jake's betrayal had inadvertently created. By forcing me to demonstrate my investigative capabilities and strategic thinking under extreme personal pressure, his affair had showcased skills that I'd never had the opportunity to market in civilian contexts. My first assignment with Fortress Defense Solutions involved investigating suspected financial fraud at Peterson Air Force Base, where a civilian contractor was allegedly overcharging for maintenance services while providing substandard work that compromised base security. The case required exactly the same skills I'd used to expose Jake's affair: comprehensive financial analysis, surveillance techniques, and evidence documentation that would support legal action against the contractor. The investigation revealed a fraud scheme that had cost the Air Force over $2 million in unnecessary expenses, while creating security vulnerabilities that could have endangered military personnel. My comprehensive report led to the contractor's termination, criminal prosecution, and recovery of stolen funds, earning recognition from base commanders and Defense Department officials who were impressed by the thoroughness and professionalism of my work. The success of my first case led to additional assignments throughout Colorado, New Mexico, and Arizona, investigating everything from security breaches at weapons storage facilities to personnel misconduct at military training centers. Each case reinforced my reputation as an investigator who could uncover complex deceptions and present findings in ways that supported effective legal and administrative responses. Within 6 months of starting with Fortress Defense Solutions, I'd been promoted to senior investigator and assigned to lead a team of former military personnel who specialized in different aspects of security and fraud investigation. My military leadership experience translated perfectly to managing civilian investigators, and my success rate in resolving complex cases made me one of the company's most valuable assets. The financial transformation was equally dramatic. My new salary, combined with veterans' disability benefits and the resolution of my divorce from Jake, provided financial security that exceeded anything I'd experienced during my military service. I was able to purchase a larger house in Colorado Springs' most desirable neighborhood, invest in retirement accounts that would provide long-term financial independence, and establish emergency funds that would protect me from future financial crises. More importantly, I'd achieved financial independence that was entirely my own creation rather than dependent on someone else's career success or financial decisions. The military wife who'd once worried about Jake's income and career advancement had become a successful professional whose financial security couldn't be threatened by anyone else's choices or betrayals. The personal transformation was equally profound. Military service had taught me discipline, strategic thinking, and leadership skills, but civilian success in high-stakes investigations had taught me confidence in my own judgment and abilities that I'd never fully developed during my Army career. The woman who'd once prioritized Jake's needs over her own aspirations had become someone who understood her own value and demanded respect from everyone in her professional and personal life. My social life expanded to include colleagues from the defense contracting industry, fellow veterans who were building successful civilian careers, and other professionals who appreciated my military background and investigative expertise. The narrow social circle I'd maintained as Jake's wife had been replaced by a diverse network of people who valued my contributions and supported my continued success. Dating became an option rather than a necessity, as I developed the confidence, and financial independence to choose relationships based on genuine compatibility rather than security needs. The men I met through professional networks and social activities understood my military background and career ambitions, creating opportunities for connections that were based on mutual respect rather than traditional gender roles or financial dependence. My reputation in Colorado Springs business community was transformed from Jake's betrayed wife to a respected professional who demonstrated remarkable resilience and strategic thinking under extreme pressure. The public nature of my revelation at the construction banquet had initially created gossip and speculation, but the success of my post-divorce career had shifted public opinion to admiration for my strength and intelligence. Business leaders who'd witnessed my presentation began referring clients to Fortress Defense Solutions, specifically because they wanted to work with the investigator who'd demonstrated such comprehensive planning and flawless execution. My military background and proven ability to handle complex, sensitive situations made me the preferred choice for investigations that required discretion and professional expertise. The contrast between my flourishing career and Jake's continued struggles was stark and satisfying. While I was building a reputation as one of the Southwest's most effective defense investigators, Jake remained unemployed and facing potential criminal prosecution for his theft from Pinnacle Construction. His attempts to find work in project management were unsuccessful because his professional reputation had been permanently damaged by his termination for cause and the widespread knowledge of his misconduct. Jake's financial situation deteriorated rapidly as he burned through his savings while paying legal fees and attempting to avoid criminal charges. The expensive lifestyle he'd maintained during his affair with Megan was replaced by basic survival concerns about housing costs, health insurance, and legal representation. The man who'd once stolen money to fund romantic dinners was now struggling to pay for basic necessities while facing the possibility of felony charges. Megan's situation was equally dire, as her real estate license had been suspended pending the outcome of the state investigation into her professional conduct. Her income had dropped to zero, and her attempts to find work in related fields were unsuccessful because potential employers were aware of her association with Jake's fraud and professional misconduct. The luxury lifestyle she'd enjoyed during their affair had been replaced by financial stress and social isolation. Their relationship had ended completely within 2 months of my public revelation, unable to survive the financial pressure and mutual blame that characterized their response to the crisis they'd created. The romance that had seemed so perfect when built on stolen money and elaborate deception collapsed immediately when faced with realistic consequences and adult responsibilities. The transformation phase of my operation was complete, and I'd successfully converted the devastating betrayal of my marriage into the foundation for a career that exceeded my most ambitious expectations. The combat veteran who'd returned from deployment to discover her husband's affair had become a successful professional whose expertise was valued throughout the defense contracting industry. Jake's betrayal had inadvertently created the opportunity for me to discover capabilities I'd never fully developed during my military service, and his systematic deception had forced me to demonstrate skills that were extremely valuable in civilian contexts. The woman he'd dismissed as boring and predictable had become someone whose strategic thinking and investigative abilities were sought after by some of the most demanding employers in the defense industry. My new life was built on my own achievements, rather than someone else's success, and my future was determined by my own choices rather than another person's betrayals. The military training that had once been subordinated to supporting Jake's career had become the foundation for my own professional success, and the strength that had carried me through combat deployments was now driving civilian achievements that would provide security and satisfaction for the rest of my life. 18 months after the night I destroyed Jake's perfect new life at the Pinnacle Construction banquet, I found myself sitting across from him at a downtown Colorado Springs coffee shop, watching a man I barely recognized struggle to articulate an apology that was 8 years too late. The confident project manager who had once charmed clients and stolen company funds to finance his affair had been replaced by someone who looked exhausted, desperate, and genuinely broken by the consequences of choices he was still trying to understand. Jake had requested this meeting through my attorney, claiming he needed closure and wanted to apologize properly for the damage he'd caused to our marriage and my trust. I'd agreed to see him primarily out of curiosity about how completely his life had unraveled since his affair with Megan was exposed, and to demonstrate the contrast between his current situation and the successful career I'd built from the ruins of our relationship. The man sitting across from me bore little resemblance to the husband who'd picked me up from the airport after my final deployment. Jake had lost significant weight, his clothes were inexpensive and ill-fitting, and his demeanor suggested someone who'd been systematically defeated by circumstances he couldn't control or manipulate. His expensive watch, designer clothes, and confident bearing had been replaced by the appearance of someone struggling with basic financial survival. "Rebecca, I know I don't deserve your time or attention," Jake began, his voice carrying none of the smooth charm that had once made him successful in business negotiations. "But I needed to tell you that I finally understand what I destroyed and why you responded the way you did." His opening revealed how completely his perspective had changed since the night of my public revelation. The man who'd once focused on damage control and legal technicalities was now attempting to accept responsibility for actions he'd spent months trying to minimize or explain away. "I've had a lot of time to think about what I did to our marriage and why I made such destructive choices," Jake continued, stirring his coffee with nervous energy that suggested he was genuinely uncomfortable with the conversation he'd requested. "The affair with Megan wasn't about her being better than you or our marriage being inadequate. It was about my own insecurity and fear that I wasn't as impressive as I wanted to believe." The admission represented growth I hadn't expected from someone who'd demonstrated such poor judgment and character during our marriage crisis. Jake's analysis of his motivations was more honest and self-aware than anything he'd offered during our divorce proceedings or his desperate attempts at reconciliation. "While you were deployed serving our country, I was feeling inadequate and boring compared to the excitement and danger of your military career," he explained. "Megan made me feel like someone important and dynamic rather than just the civilian husband waiting at home for his wife to return from more meaningful work." His explanation revealed psychological dynamics I'd suspected but never heard him acknowledge during our marriage. Jake's support for my military career had apparently masked feelings of inadequacy and resentment that he'd never been willing to discuss honestly, leading him to seek validation through an affair that made him feel more significant than his role as a military spouse. "I convinced myself that you were too focused on military service to appreciate what I was contributing to our relationship," Jake continued. "But the truth is that I was threatened by your strength and accomplishments, and I found someone who made me feel like the successful, important person I wanted to be, rather than accepting who I actually was." The psychological insight was accurate and demonstrated genuine self-reflection that suggested Jake had used his professional destruction and social isolation for serious personal growth. The man who'd once blamed others for his choices was now taking responsibility for motivations he'd previously been unwilling to examine. "What I realize now is that you were always the stronger, smarter, more capable person in our relationship," Jake said, his voice breaking slightly with what appeared to be genuine emotion. "Your military service, your ability to handle separation and danger, your strategic thinking, all of that intimidated me because it highlighted my own limitations and fears." His acknowledgement of my capabilities was something I'd never heard. During our 8-year marriage, when Jake had consistently positioned himself as the practical, business-minded partner, while treating my military career as a temporary phase, we'd eventually move beyond. Hearing him recognize my strength and intelligence was validating in ways I hadn't expected, even though his recognition was too late to salvage our relationship. "The night you exposed my affair at the construction banquet was the first time I truly understood who I'd been married to," Jake continued. "The comprehensive investigation, the strategic planning, the flawless execution, you demonstrated capabilities I'd never fully appreciated because I was too threatened by your competence to acknowledge it." His assessment of my tactical response was accurate and showed that he now understood the difference between the supportive military wife he'd taken for granted and the strategic thinker who'd systematically destroyed his affair and professional reputation. Jake had finally grasped that underestimating my intelligence and capabilities had been the most costly mistake of his life. "I know this is too little, too late, but I need you to understand that losing you didn't just end our marriage," Jake said, his composure beginning to crack as he processed the full scope of what his choices had cost him. It made me realize that I'd spent 8 years married to someone extraordinary while being too insecure and selfish to appreciate what I had. The conversation revealed that Jake's personal growth had been purchased through comprehensive professional and social destruction that had forced him to confront truths about himself he'd successfully avoided throughout our marriage. His unemployment, legal problems, and social isolation had apparently created opportunities for self-reflection that success and confidence had never provided. "How are you doing now?" I asked, curious about the practical details of how completely his life had changed since the night of my revelation. Jake's response painted a picture of someone whose existence had been reduced to basic survival concerns after years of comfortable professional success. He was working temporary construction jobs that paid a fraction of his former project management salary, living in a studio apartment that was smaller than our former master bedroom, and struggling with depression and anxiety that made even simple daily tasks challenging. "The criminal charges were dropped when I agreed to repay everything I'd stolen from Pinnacle Construction," Jake explained. "But the financial restitution and legal fees used up all my savings, and no construction company in Colorado will hire me for management positions because of what happened." His professional exile was complete and permanent, as I'd anticipated when I chose to expose his misconduct at an industry event rather than handling our marital problems privately. Jake's career in Colorado's construction industry was over, and his options for rebuilding professionally were limited by the widespread knowledge of his theft and termination for cause. "Megan and I lasted about 6 weeks after your revelation," Jake continued, answering a question I hadn't asked but was curious about. "Once the financial pressure and legal problems started, we realized we didn't actually have much in common besides the excitement of sneaking around and the money I was stealing to fund our relationship. The collapse of their affair under realistic pressure confirmed my assessment that their connection had been built on convenience and stolen resources, rather than genuine compatibility or emotional depth. Without the artificial elements that had made their relationship exciting and financially comfortable, Jake and Megan had discovered they were essentially strangers who'd shared an expensive fantasy rather than building something substantial. She moved back to California about a year ago after her real estate license was permanently suspended, Jake added. Last I heard, she was working in retail and trying to rebuild her career in a state where people don't know about what happened. Here. Megan's professional destruction had been as complete as Jake's, confirming that both of them had paid permanent prices for their temporary relationship. The woman who'd encouraged Jake to prioritize their affair over his marriage obligations had discovered that associating with professional misconduct had consequences that extended far beyond the immediate excitement of their secret romance. Our conversation concluded. Jake made one final attempt to express the depth of his regret and the lessons he'd learned through losing everything he'd once valued. His words carried genuine emotion and insight that suggested he'd achieved the kind of self-awareness that often comes only through comprehensive failure and forced introspection. "Rebecca, I know I can never undo the damage I caused or earn your forgiveness," Jake said as we prepared to leave the coffee shop. "But I want you to know that watching you succeed after everything I put you through has been the only positive thing to come from this entire disaster. You've become everything you were always capable of being, and I'm genuinely proud of what you've accomplished." His acknowledgement of my success was generous and demonstrated growth that I respected, even though it couldn't change the history between us. Jake had finally learned to appreciate qualities in me that he'd been too threatened to recognize during our marriage, but his recognition was a gift to his own growth rather than something I needed for my continued success. I hope you find a way to rebuild your life in a direction that makes you genuinely happy, I replied, offering the kind of closure that allowed both of us to move forward without lingering resentment or unfinished emotional business. As I drove home from our meeting, I reflected on how completely both of our lives had been transformed by the choices Jake had made during my final deployment. His betrayal had cost him everything he'd once valued: his career, his marriage, his financial security, and his social standing, while creating opportunities for me to discover capabilities and achieve success that exceeded anything I'd accomplished. During my military service, the woman Jake had underestimated and betrayed had become someone whose professional expertise was valued throughout the defense contracting industry, whose financial independence provided security that no one else's choices could threaten, and whose personal strength had been proven through surviving the worst someone could do to her and emerging stronger than before. The gift Jake had promised to give me for our anniversary, something that would blow my mind, had indeed transformed everything, just not in any way he could have anticipated. His betrayal had forced me to discover who I really was when I wasn't defined by someone else's needs and expectations, and that discovery had led to achievements that surpassed every goal I'd set during my military career. The boring military wife he'd discarded in favor of someone more exciting had become a successful professional, whose strategic thinking and investigative abilities were sought after by the most demanding employers in her field, and she was just beginning to understand the full scope of what she was capable of achieving when her talents weren't subordinated to supporting someone else's dreams. 3 years after that final coffee shop conversation with Jake, I stood in the conference room of my own investigative consulting firm, Martinez Security Solutions, addressing a room full of military veterans who were transitioning to civilian careers in defense contracting and private security. The woman who'd once planned her life around someone else's needs had built a company that employed 12 former service members and handled high-stakes investigations throughout the Southwest region. The transformation was complete in ways I'd never imagined possible during those dark days when I first discovered Jake's betrayal. What had begun as a desperate response to marital deception had evolved into expertise that was valued by Fortune 500 companies, defense contractors, and government agencies who needed complex investigations handled with military precision and absolute discretion. My company's reputation was built on the same principles I'd applied to exposing Jake's affair: comprehensive intelligence gathering, strategic planning, and flawless execution that left no room for error or escape. The skills that had once seemed like overkill for handling personal betrayal had proven to be exactly what corporate clients needed when dealing with fraud, security breaches, and personnel misconduct that could cost millions of dollars or compromise national security. The morning's briefing focused on our largest case to date, a multi-million-dollar defense contracting fraud that involved 3 companies and potentially compromised security at military installations across 4 states. The investigation required coordination between federal agencies, military commands, and civilian law enforcement, exactly the kind of complex operation that my military background and proven investigative abilities made me uniquely qualified to lead. The pattern we've identified shows systematic overbilling combined with deliberate security vulnerabilities that could have endangered military personnel, I explained to my team, clicking through evidence slides that documented financial fraud and security breaches with the same attention to detail I'd once applied to Jake's credit card statements and hotel receipts. The case would likely result in criminal prosecutions, contract terminations, and policy changes that would affect defense contracting throughout the region. My company's work would protect military families and ensure that service members received the equipment and security they deserved, making my civilian career feel as meaningful as my years in uniform. After the briefing concluded, I returned to my private office to review proposals for expansion into cybersecurity investigations and corporate intelligence services. The growth opportunities were exciting and challenging, requiring skills and expertise that I was still developing but felt confident about mastering. The woman who'd once worried about Jake's career advancement was now planning strategic expansion, that would establish her company as a regional leader in defense and corporate investigations. My personal life had evolved to match my professional success. 6 months earlier, I'd begun dating Colonel Michael Torres, a recently retired Army intelligence officer who understood my military background and respected my civilian achievements without feeling threatened by my success or independence. Our relationship was built on mutual respect, shared values, and genuine compatibility rather than financial dependence or traditional gender roles. Michael's support for my career was comprehensive and authentic, based on admiration for my capabilities, rather than obligation or social expectations. He celebrated my professional victories, provided thoughtful advice about business challenges, and maintained his own successful consulting practice without competing with or diminishing my achievements. The partnership we were building represented everything I'd thought I had with Jake, but had never actually experienced. The contrast between my current relationship and my marriage was stark and enlightening. Michael encouraged my ambitions, celebrated my independence, and contributed to our shared life without expecting me to prioritize his needs over my own goals. The woman who'd once subordinated her career to support someone else's dreams was now in a relationship where both partners supported each other's success without sacrifice or resentment. My financial situation exceeded every goal I'd set during my military service or my marriage to Jake. The company I'd built was generating revenue that provided not just personal security, but the ability to invest in other veterans' career transitions, support military families facing hardship, and contribute to causes that had meaning beyond personal profit. The economic independence I'd achieved was comprehensive and permanent, based on my own abilities rather than someone else's success. The social recognition that accompanied my professional achievements was gratifying in ways I'd never anticipated. I'd been featured in business publications, invited to speak at military transition conferences, and consulted by government agencies about best practices for security investigations. The respect I'd earned was based on proven competence rather than reflected glory from someone else's accomplishments. Most importantly, I'd learned to value my own judgment and capabilities without needing external validation or approval. The woman who'd once sought Jake's appreciation for her contributions had become someone who understood her own worth and demanded appropriate recognition from everyone in her professional and personal life. The lesson that emerged from surviving Jake's betrayal was that the most devastating experiences often reveal strengths and capabilities we never knew we possessed. His affair had forced me to develop skills I'd never needed during our marriage, demonstrate resilience I'd never been required to show, and discover that my military training was far more valuable in civilian contexts than I'd ever realized. Jake's betrayal had inadvertently created the opportunity for me to become the person I was always capable of being, but had never been allowed to develop fully. The supportive military wife who'd prioritized someone else's needs had been replaced by a successful professional whose expertise was valued throughout her industry and whose personal strength was proven through surviving the worst someone could do to her. The woman Jake had dismissed as boring and predictable had built something remarkable from the ruins of their relationship, while he remained trapped by consequences of choices he was still struggling to understand. His attempt to replace me with someone more exciting had taught him that he'd been married to someone extraordinary who'd been too generous to demand the appreciation she deserved. Looking back on the journey from that devastating anniversary, party to the successful business I now owned, I understood that Jake's promise to give me a gift that would blow my mind had been fulfilled in ways neither of us could have anticipated. His betrayal had been the catalyst for discovering capabilities, achieving success, and building relationships that exceeded everything I'd thought possible during my military career. The boring military wife he'd discarded had become a successful entrepreneur whose strategic thinking and investigative expertise were sought after by the most demanding clients in the defense industry. She'd proven that betraying a combat veteran was the worst tactical decision anyone could make, and she'd built a life that was extraordinary in every way that mattered. The gift Jake had given me wasn't just the opportunity to discover my own. Strength. It was the chance to help other veterans realize their own potential and build careers that honored their service while providing the security and satisfaction they'd earned through their sacrifice. Every success my company achieved was proof that military training translated perfectly to civilian excellence when applied by someone who understood both strategic thinking and personal resilience. The story that began with devastating betrayal had become one of transformation, success, and the kind of personal victory that could only be achieved by someone who refused to let other people's choices define her future. The woman who'd survived combat deployments had proven she could survive anything, and she was using that strength to build something that would last far beyond the marriage that had once seemed like her entire world. Thank you for joining me on this journey from betrayal to triumph. If this story of turning devastating deception into strategic victory resonated with you, please subscribe to my channel and hit that notification bell. Share your own stories of overcoming betrayal in the comments below. I read every single one, and your experiences help other viewers understand they're not alone in facing these challenges. Tomorrow, I'm sharing the tactical methods I use to conduct surveillance and gather evidence without detection, plus the legal strategies that protected me throughout the entire operation. You won't want to miss those details if you're dealing with your own situation that requires strategic planning and careful documentation. Remember, the worst thing someone can do to you often creates the opportunity to discover who you really are when you're not defined by their limitations or expectations. Subscribe now and let's continue building the strength and wisdom that turns life's biggest challenges into your greatest victories.